Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on collateral changes for US dollar and euro derivatives. My name is Ann Battle, and I'm head of benchmark reform at ISDA. I'm joined by my colleague, Rick Sandiland, Senior Counsel for Europe at ISDA, and representatives of Linklaters, including Deepak Sitlani, Hannah Patterson, Sarah Willis, and Susanna Brunton. Today's webinar is going to cover several topics related to the collateral changes that are occurring in 2020. First, we'll talk about the CCP discounting changes that recently occurred for euro-denominated derivatives and will occur soon for US dollar derivatives. Then we'll turn to the recently published new definitional booklet that counterparties can use to designate a standard rate as the interest amount in their CSAs for non-cleared derivatives. And we'll talk about bilateral templates that ISDA published this summer for amending US dollar and euro CSAs or other collateral agreements for non-cleared derivatives so that the interest amount references euro STR and or SOFR. Finally, we'll have a demonstration of how market participants can use ISDA Create to agree to these bilateral templates. We've also reserved time at the end of today's webinar for questions and answers. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please submit them in the question box and we'll answer them as we're able to at the end. And there will also be an opportunity to submit additional questions at the end of the content. So I'm going to start with the CCP discounting and price alignment transition. As mentioned, this transition occurred in July for euro-denominated derivatives. The change was from EONIA discounting and price alignment to euro STR or ESTR discounting and alignment. The CCPs that effectuated this change provided cash compensation between themselves and each clearing member to compensate for the change in value between EONIA and euro STR. The change was relatively straightforward because EONIA is currently a tracker for euro STR. And so risk compensation, which we'll see is applicable in the US dollar change, was not applicable to this change. So now, since this change has occurred, derivatives that are cleared at the major CCPs that effectuated this change pay price alignment and discounting based on euro STR. The change for US dollar will occur around October 16th, 2020. There will, similar to the euro change, be a value compensation payable between the CCPs and their clearing members with US dollar denominated derivatives. But there will also be risk compensation in the form of Fed funds, which is the current price alignment and discounting rate for US dollar derivatives, and SOFR, which will be the new rate, basis swaps. As Sarah will come on to in a minute, the way that each CCP is allocating and then running an auction for these basis swaps differs slightly between LCH and CME, but for the most part, they will be allocated to all accounts at the CCP, other than in the case of LCH, clients that have opted out of receiving the swap. However, as mentioned, the CCPs will also run two similar but slightly different auction processes where clearing members may dispose of and or bid for these swaps in the market. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah to go through the expected processes at each of CME and LCH.
Thank you, Anne. So as Anne has already mentioned, although the overall outcome and the process at both CME and LCH is similar, there are some differences between how each CCP is handling the transition. So starting with the similarities, both CCPs will be transitioning to SOFR on the same day. That's scheduled for October the 16th. In terms of how the transition will actually take place, in the case of CME, at close of business on October the 16th, CME will value all of its US dollar denominated trades using Fed funds discounting. They will then generate a discounting transition report that provides the value of all of those trades using SOFR discounting. Now, the SOFR curve that they will construct in order to provide that valuation is constructed using monthly and quarterly prices for listed SOFR futures contracts. The reason for this that CME gave is because these products are considered to be the most liquid. At LCH, on the other hand, similar to CME, at close of business on October the 16th, they will value all of their US dollar denominated trades using Fed funds discounting and SOFR discounting. But unlike CME, they will construct the SOFR curve that they use to value these transactions using a price that will be generated by a mid-setting auction that they will hold on October the 16th, which I'll come on to discuss shortly. So as Anne mentioned, both CCPs will be providing for cash compensation to be payable between the CCP and its members. And that cash compensation will be calculated using the SOFR and Fed funds values that are generated at close of business on October the 16th. In terms of the divergence between the two approaches taken by the CCPs, that becomes more significant in the context of the risk compensation and the discounting risk swaps that the CCPs will be allocating to accounts. So taking CME first, in order to compensate for the risk impact of this transition, CME is going to book a mandatory series of MPV neutral Fed funds against SOFR basis swaps to all members' accounts, and that's both their house and their client accounts. LCH, on the other hand, will again, in the same way, book a series of MPV neutral Fed funds against SOFR basis swaps to all members' accounts. But importantly, in respect of their client accounts, members do have the option to opt out of receiving those swaps, and they will instead receive cash compensation rather than the swap. Now, for those clients who don't want to receive these discounting risk swaps, and we understand that there are a number of clients in the market who don't want to receive such swaps because the primary reason for this is that they don't hedge their discounting risk. And so for them, the swaps actually don't represent a rehedging of that risk. It's just an additional swap that they will receive. So for them at CME, on the 19th of October, there will be an auction, and clearing members will have the option to dispose of unwanted basis swaps on behalf of their clients. In the case of LCH, if clients have opted out of receiving the discounting risk swaps, on the 16th of October, there will be an auction at which those swaps are disposed of. Now, in the case of LCH, as I mentioned earlier, there are actually two auctions that are going to be held on the 16th of October. The first one is a mid-setting auction, and the purpose of this is purely to generate a mid-price on Fed funds against SOFR basis swaps that can be used for the purposes of constructing the SOFR curve that will be used to value US dollar trades going forwards and also to calculate the cash compensation that's payable. No discounting risk swaps are intended to be disposed of in that auction. A second auction will then be held on the same day, and it's that auction that will be used to dispose of any unwanted Fed funds versus SOFR basis swaps from client accounts. In the case of both CCPs, though, if the auction is not successful and there are not sufficient bids for the entire portfolio of swaps that's to be auctioned, then client accounts, in respect of whom at CME are trying to dispose of swaps, or LCH, who have opted out of receiving discounting risk swaps, may nevertheless receive those swaps as the fallback option if the auction portfolio isn't sold in whole, is that the client accounts receive the swaps that they would otherwise have been allocated. An important point to note for members and their clients is the deadlines for opting into disposal of the unwanted swaps. So for CME, clients have to opt into participating in the auction by October the 2nd, and their clearing members have to approve that opt-in by October the 9th. In the case of LCH, the opt-out of receiving the discounting risk swaps has already passed, and that was on September the 4th. On this slide, we've tried to outline some of the key issues that various market participants need to consider with respect to this transition. So starting with clearing members. One of the key things for clearing members is that they will need to familiarize themselves with this process. As we've hopefully drawn out from the previous slides, there are important differences between the process at each CCP, and it's important for clearing members to understand what those are and to educate their clients on it, and in particular to ensure that they're meeting those deadlines for the opt-in to the auction in the case of CME and the opt-out of receiving discounting risk swaps in the case of LCH. Clearing members also need to be aware that they may be required to participate in the auctions. So in the case of CME, if their client elects to dispose of swaps, they may be required to participate in the auction. And LCH has imposed a requirement that clearing members who clear a significant level of US dollar trades with LCH should use all reasonable endeavors to participate in the auction. In the case of clients, the main issue for them to be aware of is the one that I've already alluded to, that if they opt out of receiving discounting risk swaps, they may nevertheless be allocated those swaps if the auction isn't successful. Clients therefore do need to put in place contingency measures and discuss strategies with their clearing members to ensure that should they be allocated these swaps, that they're both operationally ready and have a strategy as to how they will dispose of those swaps in the market. And it's worth noting at that point the impact that a failed auction may have on the SOFR market as a whole. Which brings me on to the consideration for market participants as a whole, which is the impact of an auction not being entirely successful. And what I mean by that is if there's an auction in which not all of the allotted discounting risk swaps can be liquidated, this could be potentially disruptive to the pricing and liquidity of SOFR instruments in the market as a whole and lead to a negative impact on that market.
Thanks, Sarah. So on this next slide, we've included some additional information for market participants that fall into any of the categories that Sarah just mentioned and would like more information about the upcoming change for US dollar derivatives cleared at CME or LCH. We've also included a link to a report published earlier this year by the US CFTC Market Risk Advisory Committee, or MRAC, Interest Rate Reform Benchmark Subcommittee. That subcommittee hosted a roundtable simulation of the upcoming US dollar change. And so again, if you're one of those market participants that will be affected by the change, we encourage you to take a look at that as it goes into some of the scenarios that could play out in next month's change. So I'm now going to turn it over to Rick Sandiland to talk about collateral changes and developments for non-cleared derivatives. Rick?
Thanks, Anne. So ISDA's efforts to facilitate transition of collateral interest rates really fall into two separate limbs. There's the recently published collateral interest rate definitions as one limb, and the second limb are certain bilateral templates that users can use to amend their existing contracts. So Susanna and I are going to look at the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. These definitions were really created to respond to two related issues. Firstly, it's always been something of an anomaly that among all of the standardized definitions that ISDA produces, there's never been a standardized set of definitions for interest rates for use in collateral definitions or collateral agreements. Historically, parties to collateral agreements either took the floating rate options from interest rate definitions and tried to shoehorn them in, or probably with varying degrees of success, or they had to individually draft their own definition of interest rates. That's made amending collateral agreements more challenging over the years, because to produce a standardized amendment agreement or a protocol, it's helpful if the text being amended is also standardized. The collateral agreement interest rate definitions therefore set out standardized definitions for many of the overnight rates of cash collateral in key currencies. Secondly, the benchmark reform process has produced a number of recommendations for fallbacks to be incorporated into collateral agreements for use if a benchmark ceases to be published. The collateral agreement interest rate definitions therefore include standardized fallbacks, which Susanna will discuss in more detail in a moment. She'll also give you more detail about an important new optional tool that ISDA has created to try to future-proof the way in which the collateral agreement interest rate definitions are incorporated into parties' agreements. This method of incorporation, called interest rate override, was created in the knowledge that ISDA would be publishing successive versions of the definitions in quite quick succession. So even though the first version, with the definitions of Ionia and ESTA, was only published in February 2020, a second version with definitions of SOFR and other risk-free rate-based collateral interest rates has already been published in April 2020. Interest rate override allows the definition of rates which are added to subsequent versions of the definitions to override or substitute the non-standardized definition of those rates that were part of the collateral agreement at the time it was executed. I think that's best demonstrated with an example. So if you incorporated the first version of the definitions into your collateral agreement on an interest rate override basis, any non-standardized definition of SOFR that you might have in your collateral agreement would have been replaced by the standardized definition of SOFR collateral rate included in the second version of the definitions. Susanna, can we turn to you to take us through the definition booklet in more detail?
Thanks, Rick. So as Rick has mentioned, ISDA has published two versions of the collateral agreement interest rate definitions so far. If you hear me refer to CARD or CARDs, that is the acronym and the short form name that we are using to refer to these definitions. The two versions published so far. Version 1 was published in February of this year, and it contained only interest rates for Euro cash collateral. It contained two collateral rates. One is an ESTA collateral rate and one an Ionia collateral rate. And then very recently in August, ISDA published the second version, so version 2.0 of the CARDs. And this contained an additional 8 collateral rates. And they're all listed here on the slides. And these collateral rates are all in respect of 8 different currencies. So in total, with these additional 8 collateral rates and the 2 collateral rates which were in version 1, there's now 10 collateral rate definitions covering 9 different currencies. Now that's what is covered so far in version 2, but subsequent versions of these collateral definitions may be published to contain other collateral rates following member demand. And this is a new approach to publication of a definitional booklet, because those new rates will not be published by way of supplement, but will be incorporated into the existing definitional booklet, which will simply be reversioned and republished in full. So how do firms use these definitions? Well, first of all, firms will need to incorporate this booklet into their collateral agreement, for example, a credit support annex. And then they will specify the defined collateral rate as the interest rate in respect of cash collateral. For instance, if the parties have sterling cash collateral and they want a SONIA rate, then they specify SONIA brackets collateral rate. Now that suffix of collateral rate is important. It not only taps into the definition in the CARDS, but it distinguishes that definition and all the other operative provisions which go with it from any other definition of SONIA, for example, a definition of SONIA in the 2006 definitions. So each of these rates is subject to a permanent cessation fallback, in fact, a set of permanent cessation fallbacks, which are set out in a definition of index cessation event. Now, that definition matches very closely the definition of index cessation event, which is found in the recently finalised ISDA IBOR fallback supplement. When one of these permanent cessation events occurs, it will trigger the fallbacks that apply in respect of each of these collateral rates. So each of these rates, which are all overnight rates, are already in the IBOR fallback supplement as fallbacks to the IBOR fallbacks, with the exception of SORA. And so they already have fallbacks in the waterfall of fallbacks in that fallback supplement. So the CARDS track all of those fallbacks to make sure that there is consistency of fallbacks which apply to any given rate across the 2006 definitions and the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. Now, Rick already mentioned a new tool that parties can use, but since it is so novel, it merits just looking at that in a little bit more detail. So this is the new tool of interest rate override. You look at the bottom of the slide here, this is an extract from the definitions and shows you the exact operative provision and how this interest rate override tool works. So the example given here is for SONIA. So how do people use this? Well, when parties incorporate the definitions, there's various ways in which they can do that. They can incorporate the most recent version by simply specifying version 2.0. And that means they'll get the static version. There will never be any subsequent updates incorporated into that credit support annex. All the parties could incorporate the definitions as amended from time to time. If they specify as amended from time to time, then any subsequent versions of the collateral agreement interest rate definitions will be incorporated automatically into that credit support annex as and when they are published. Now, if they've incorporated them as amended from time to time, this is when they can use the interest rate override tool. And there's two variants of interest rate override. Parties can either specify interest rate override all rates or interest rate override and a specified rate. So coming back to our example of SONIA, if parties had just specified interest rate override dash SONIA, and they had incorporated into their CSA version 1 of the CARDS. Now, version 1 only had 2 collateral rates in it for euro cash collateral. It didn't have any rates for sterling cash collateral. But if the parties' credit support annex provided for cash collateral in sterling and provided for the interest rate on that cash collateral to be SONIA, then when version 2 was published in August, the definition of SONIA collateral rate, which was set out in version 2, would have automatically been introduced into that CSA in place of the party's definition of SONIA. In other words, it overrides the party's definition of SONIA. And firms can do this for any specified rate, or if they want to make sure they are always taking advantage of a collateral rate in the CARDS and the fallbacks that apply for that rate, then they can specify interest rate override all rates. And every time a collateral rate is introduced into the definitions, which is in respect of an interest rate that the parties have specified in their collateral agreement, that collateral rate definition in the booklet will prevail. So that's a run through of the CARDS. Now, in conjunction with the CARDS, ISDA has published a number of bilateral amendment agreements. There are 4 separate templates which have been published to date. Now, each of these amendment agreements enables parties to replace existing interest rates in collateral agreements with the collateral rate as defined in the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. And they can provide for that change to take place on a particular date. Now, the 4 different amendment agreements are set out at the bottom of the slide here. The first one on the left-hand side, the Ionia Amendment Agreement. This is a multi-agreement amendment agreement. Not only does it enable parties to amend their collateral documentation, but it also enables parties to update references to Ionia in confirmations, master agreements, and transaction documents. And we'll come on to look at the scope of that Ionia Amendment Agreement in a bit more detail on a later slide. The other 3 amendment agreements are all short form agreements. They are all shorter than the Ionia Amendment Agreement, and they only cover collateral agreements. They only enable parties to amend interest rates in collateral agreements. The first of these is the ISDA Amendment Agreement, enabling parties to replace any euro interest rate with ISDA collateral rate as defined in the CARDS. The second one is the SOFR Amendment Agreement. Now, this enables parties to replace any US dollar interest rate with SOFR collateral rate. And finally, the last template is a combined agreement, which allows parties to amend any euro interest rate or US dollar interest rate and to replace that with ISDA collateral rate and SOFR collateral rate, respectively. So that template is obviously going to be useful where parties have credit support annexes, which provide for both euro and US dollar cash collateral. Let's have a look now at some of the common features of all 4 of these templates. So all 4 of the templates obviously incorporate the collateral agreement interest rate definitions to enable parties to use the defined terms, the defined collateral rates set out therein. And parties can incorporate those definitions as amended from time to time, or they can just incorporate the version that applies as at the date of entry into the bilateral amendment agreement. As we just discussed, if they do incorporate the CARDS as amended from time to time, they can also use the tool interest rate override and switch that on in respect of all rates to take advantage of any future updates to the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. All 4 templates allow parties to apply the amendments to all or some of their collateral agreements. So we will have a look on the next slide at the scope of the documentation covered by these templates. They allow parties to select the date on which the amendments will apply, which means that parties could apply the amendments to the middle of an interest period. Because of that, all of the templates contemplate that the parties will provide for what happens if there is a broken interest period, if the change takes effect in the middle of an interest period. The templates also have a provision allowing the parties to set out whether there will be any compensation exchanged in respect of the amendments. But no, there is no methodology set out for how that compensation would be calculated and how the parties would agree the amount of the compensation, and whether any compensation will be exchanged is left entirely to the parties. So the parties can choose the effective date of the amendments, and the templates all distinguish 2 different dates. First of all, there is an amendment effective date. That's the date upon which the agreement itself becomes effective. For example, that may well be the date of signing. And then secondly, there is a defined term of a relevant date. And this is the date upon which the change is effective. So that's the date when the interest rate is switched. And the reason for having a different date is twofold. First of all, it means that, for example, in the bilateral amendment agreement, parties could choose different rates in respect of the switch for ISDA and SOFR. The parties might want to switch to ISDA immediately because the CCPs have already moved their price alignment interest to ISDA, and they may choose to wait to move to SOFR until the 16th of October, when the CCPs are moving their price alignment interest to SOFR. The other reason for allowing for a separate definition of a relevant date is that parties might want to make different choices in respect of different sets of agreement. This is particularly relevant to the IONIA Amendment Agreement, where it covers different documentation and different amendments in respect of that documentation, which we'll look at in a bit more detail when we come on to the IONIA Amendment Agreement. Finally, the parties can choose the governing law and jurisdiction of the amendment agreement, but that choice is limited to English law or New York law. But note that the governing law as to the effect of the amendments in respect of the underlying documentation being amended will be the governing law of that underlying documentation, irrespective of whether that is the same or different governing law from the law that the parties have chosen to govern the actual amendment agreement. So those are the features which are common to all four of the templates. And then in addition, the IONIA Amendment Agreement has some additional features. So in addition to amending collateral agreements, parties can also amend confirmations. So they can change IONIA floating rate options in confirmations, and they can also change references to IONIA in master agreements and transaction documentation. Let's have a look in a bit more detail as to the elections which parties can make in the IONIA Amendment Agreement. So this is a template agreement to either replace IONIA or to embed fallbacks to IONIA in both legacy transactions and collateral agreements. On the slide here, you have the three groups of documentation which can be amended. And so first of all, parties can amend their confirmations. Now, their confirmations might refer to the IONIA floating rate options set out in the 2006 definitions. These floating rate options were updated last year to embed fallbacks via Supplement 60. So what firms could do is update those IONIA floating rate options to the floating rate options as set out in Supplement 60, thereby embedding fallbacks into their confirmation. Alternatively, they could replace the IONIA floating rate option with the ISDA floating rate option. That's the Euro-USTR compound floating rate option, which was published in Supplement 59 to the 2006 definitions last year. And finally, they could choose to replace the IONIA floating rate option with the ISDA floating rate option, but to add on an 8.5 basis point spread to maintain economic equivalence with the IONIA floating rate option that is being replaced. In addition, it allows parties to amend credit support documents, as we've discussed, and they can do that to replace an IONIA interest rate either with IONIA collateral rate or ISDA collateral rate. Now, if parties replace the IONIA interest rate with IONIA collateral rate, they will get all the fallbacks to IONIA, and the first fallback is obviously to ISDA, but it adds on 8.5 basis points. So that's one reason that firms might choose to replace an IONIA interest rate with IONIA collateral rate, because they will still be able to fall back to ISDA, but they will maintain economic equivalence with the rate that's being replaced. And the final group of documents which can be replaced is master agreements or any other transaction documents which have an IONIA reference. So, for example, if firms have entered into a long-form confirmation which has collateral-like terms embedded in that confirmation, and those collateral terms provide for IONIA as an interest rate, then that in itself is not a collateral agreement. It's certainly not one of the specified covered collateral agreements, but they could use this option to amend that IONIA reference that is in that transaction document. And the same as for amending credit support documents, the parties choose to amend that IONIA reference to either the IONIA collateral rate or the ISDA collateral rate both being the defined terms in the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. Now let's have a look at the scope of all of these amendment agreements. So there are various options as to the scope of the covered documents. In the first column on the left-hand side, we have the covered documents, which will apply as standard if the parties don't make any amendments. There is a definition in all of these amendment agreements of covered documents, and this lists out the 16 is the published variation margin credit support documents. So they will apply as standard. Now, in addition, parties can add in additional documents listed in an annex. They would have to set those documents out in an annex. That annex is empty. There are no additional documents set out in that annex. So unlike the ISDA fallback protocol, which does cover certain third-party published documentation, these templates don't cover any third-party published documentation, and ISDA has not done any due diligence in respect of any such documentation. So if parties choose this option and they add in documents published by a third party, they will need to conduct their own due diligence as to the effectiveness of the changes in that agreement in respect of that third party published documentation. So in respect of the 3 collateral amendment agreements, the 3 short form agreements, obviously the scope for including additional documentation is only in respect of credit support documents. Whereas the Ionia Amendment Agreement, which is a multi-agreement amendment agreement, allows parties to add in additional credit support documents, additional master agreements, or additional transaction documents. Then in the second column, parties have the option to actually exclude documents from scope. So they can narrow the scope of those published documents. Those 16 is the published documents by excluding certain of those. And they do that either by listing them in an annex as a party agreed excluded document, or if they are entering into that document by specifying in that document that such document is a party agreed excluded document for the purposes of the relevant bilateral amendment agreement. Again, similar to additional documents, in respect of the 3 collateral amendment agreements, it's only credit support documents that parties are excluding, whereas the Ionia Amendment Agreement, parties can exclude credit support documents, master agreements, or indeed any transaction documents. And the final option in the far right-hand column is for the parties to specify the documents that are going to be covered by the template. So this is the option of specified covered documents. If parties use this option, then they are overriding the definition of covered documents. So none of the listed covered documents would be amended. The only documents that would be amended are the ones that the parties specify themselves in an annex. The parties might use this option if they are amending all of their collateral documentation across the board by another method, but they have a particular transaction which, for whatever the reason, they want to amend, then this template can be used for that. So it is flexible enough to be used to amend even one single collateral agreement, or for the Ionia Amendment Agreement, to amend one single confirmation. To do this, there is a toggle which parties have to switch on. So at the beginning of each election, there is an option that says specified covered documents applicable or not applicable. So parties toggle this on and off. If they specify not applicable, then they get the standard covered documents. But if they specify applicable, then the only documents that will be amended are those that are listed in an annex. For the collateral amendment agreements, these are only credit support documents which can be specified. But the Ionia Amendment Agreement allows parties to specify credit support documents, master agreements, or transaction documents. And now I'll hand over to Deepak and Hannah to run you through how these templates can be entered into via ISDA Create.
Great, thanks, Susanna. So Susanna and Rick have run you through the documentary tools that you have available to you in order to update collateral agreements in particular to refer to SOFR and Euro FCR respectively. But in addition, ISDA has provided a digital tool to effect those amendments as well, and that's known as ISDA Create. And so ISDA Create is an online solution that allows parties not only to produce, but also to negotiate and execute derivatives documentation completely online. It was first launched last year with a relatively narrow use case, which was the initial margin documents. But during the course of this year, we've seen and will continue to see an expansion in the range of documents covered by ISDA Create. So significantly, for the purposes of this webinar, the 4 template amendment agreements that Susanna and Rick touched on will be on the platform. And in addition, the rate reform documents that relate to the IBOR protocol will also be on the platform when the protocol is launched. And later on this year, we will also see the schedule to the ISDA Master Agreement, which reflects the clause library work that has been done over the past year or so. There are a number of firms already using ISDA Create in anger, and also there are a number of firms who are in the tested environment for it. So I'll very quickly run you through the key features and then hand over to Hannah, who can run you through the platform. There are 4 key features within ISDA Create. So the first one is the ability to generate documents. So that allows you to create templates for various negotiation positions and then produce them on a bulk basis. You are also allowed to have advisors negotiate on your behalf or generate documents on your behalf. So once you have generated a document, you can then negotiate all of that document online. So that includes exchanging comments, producing black lines of particular provisions, and then when it comes to execution or even part of the negotiation process, you can also manage internal approvals. And that means you will be able to record the approval process all on the platform and have a complete audit trail for it for each negotiation. And then finally, and possibly most significantly, you are able to capture the data at source. So what this means is that for every negotiated provision, you can produce a report that will tell you what that provision is. So without the need, for example, to go and due diligence any executed agreements, and that data is then available on a 100% accurate basis to operationalize downstream. So that at a high level is what the platform does. The next slide just shows you some contact details if you do want more information on getting access to ISDA Create. But it's probably better to show rather than tell. So I'll hand over to Hannah to run you through the platform.
So thanks, Dee. So as mentioned by Deepak, ISDA Create is a platform to procure, deliver, negotiate, and execute derivatives documentation. And I'm going to run through a little bit of the functionality. But what I would say is that everything that I run through here is available for all of the different documentation packs or the document suites that are available on the platform. But obviously for today's webinar, I'm going to focus on the interest rate reform documents. So when you log onto the platform, you see this dashboard, which gives you a lot of information about the status of your negotiations. I'm not going to go to it in any detail here, but that's a really useful management tool to see where your negotiations are, which might be particularly relevant when you've got lots of interest rate reform documents that you're negotiating. But crucially for today, we're going to go through the interest rate reform documents, and you'll see that there are now all 4 of the published ISDA rate reform documents on there. I'm going to run through the Euro STR and software amendment agreement because I think that'll be most interesting for most participants. So if you wanted to draft this, you could select the agreement, and then that opens the agreement in this election view. Now, as an ex-lawyer myself, I find it quite, well, as a current lawyer, in fact, I find it quite hard to kind of visualize this as a document. So when you open the document, you can select preview, which allows you to also see the document in a kind of the more usual ISDA published form. Then the interface on the left allows you to select or make decisions around how you want your agreement to be. And so you run through the various elections and you select whatever it is that you want to agree with your counterparty. So, for example, you can select your party names. You can include any additional language if you wanted to explain what kind of an entity you are negotiating on behalf of. You're able to make the agreement suitable to amend umbrella agreements. So if you're an investment manager acting on behalf of various funds, you have optionality to reflect that. And then we get to the kind of meat of the provisions. So the idea is, or the intention is, that these documents reflect the ISDA published form. And so where in the ISDA published form you have elections to make, those elections are now included on the ISDA create system, and you can either elect or not select them as applicable or not applicable. And when you perhaps select them as applicable, elections appear underneath. So if, for example, you wanted to specify some covered credit support documents, you could fill in, perhaps it's a CSA dated 1st of September. And then you'll see that actually that automatically populates the Annex 3, which is where if you're in the kind of off-platform mode, you would be filling in that information. You can then navigate back to the main provision, so you can see that this here on the right-hand side has now become applicable. So each time you're making an election on the left, you can see it in real time on the right. So the next thing you might want to think about is what version of the ISDA Collateral Agreement Interest Rate Definitions, or CARES, as Susanna mentioned earlier. You can specify a particular version if you knew which version you wanted to include, or you could include as amended from time to time, or the new election that Susanna talked about, the interest rate override or rate. If you wanted to at this time, you could also actually make certain of these elections require approval. So that would mean that if you later changed it and you had agreed as a template provision to include interest rate override, and a counterparty then wanted to select a different version, you would need to get approval, and that would happen through the system. It's kind of a useful feature there. The next election that appears in the published version is around broken interest periods. So this election allows you to either select something as applicable here, or you could make it not applicable and it would disappear. If you make that applicable, the later election appears, which would require you to think about when the interest amount will be calculated using the new Euro SDR collateral rate or the SOFR collateral rate. And you can either select on or after the relevant date, or on or after the first period. You're also able to then fill in the provisions around compensation. So if you wanted to make that applicable, you then have to select whether it would be Party A paying Party B paying Party A, or payments are separately notified. And if you decide that Party A is going to pay Party B an amount, you would then be kind of prompted to include a payment amount and date, which you can automatically include, and you'll see that then appears on the right-hand side here. You can select the relevant currency and the date that you would want that to be paid. You can then select if that constitutes a payment obligation. The next election in the document would be around representations. And if you wanted to make some other election here that wasn't included, you could also include bespoke. You have choices around governing law, which reflects what is in the published document. And then obviously there's some related elections to that. So you can select if service of process is relevant, if waiver of trial by jury is relevant, and if contract rights of third party is relevant. As with any of the document, you might want to make changes to this front end that hadn't been foreseen by the ISDA drafting process. So there's also an ability to include other provisions. And here, if you wanted to make changes to any of the previous paragraphs, or if you wanted to make some other change while you're amending your CSA, then you could do so here. There's also an ability to kind of amend certain definitions that tie into the other provisions that you've been drafting. So effective date is one of those, and you can elect whether the amendment effective date is the date of this agreement, a particular date, or another date that you want to specify. The same in relation to relevant date. That's also something that you're able to fill in. You're then able to select your signature box, include any additional credit support documents, or any party agreed excluded master agreements. Once you've gone through that process, you're then able to select parties and send that to your counterparty. One of the great things about ISDA Create actually is that you would then be able to, if you wanted to, send this on to multiple counterparties at the same time. Now, I'm not going to show you how to do a full-on negotiation. If you wanted a demonstration of that, then do please contact the ISDA Create team, and we'd be happy to organise a demonstration. I'll just show you a couple of other points around the interest rate reform documents. So, as mentioned, we also have the software amendment agreement, the Euro SDR amendment agreement, and the EOU amendment agreement. And I'll just show you the EOU amendment agreement because that one is slightly different to the other two. The other two are very similar, but obviously just amend the either the USD or the Euro Collateral agreement. So the EOU amendment agreement has quite a little bit more in terms of elections, and that reflects the published version, which can amend not only credit support documents but other agreements and transactions. So again, I like to select the preview. If you want to, you can use this navigation panel on the left to go directly to particular provisions that you want to draft at this time. So for example, I might want to start by thinking about amendment to the EOU floating rate options. I'll just hide that navigation panel now that I'm here. I can click on this icon, which brings me to this provision, and you can see that I can make elections. So if I want to make this applicable, so I want to update the definition of EONIA in the EONIA floating rate options, and then able to specify covered documents if that's relevant, or perhaps now it's not applicable. And then I'm able to make amendments from including the amendment effective date regarding supplement 60. So it might be that I want to make Euro EONIA OSI compound as defined in supplement 60 applicable. So I can do that and then make the other two not applicable. Perhaps then I want to amend to replace EONIA floating rate option with Euro SDR floating rate option. Again, once you select applicable, new ability, like the ability to amend, new elections will appear, and so you'll have the ability to do different things. Now, it may be that this isn't relevant if you've selected 1.1, so I might make that not applicable. And then perhaps we'll have a look at election 9. So this allows you to amend references to EONIA in covered master agreements and covered transaction documents. So if I was to make this applicable, you can see this whole paragraph becomes dark blue, and that's kind of indicating which bit I'm currently amending. So if I want to specify covered documents, perhaps here it's not all documents, so I want to specify certain covered documents. And we can go to the Annex 3 so we can see where we're actually filling this in. And it may be that for the replacement of EONIA in covered master agreements or covered transaction documents with EONIA collateral rate, I want to include particular ISDA dated 1st of September. But in relation to the ISDA dated 2nd of September, I perhaps want to do something different. I want to replace it with Euro SDR collateral rate. So I'm able to do that, and you'll see in these boxes on the right-hand side that automatically populates. And then able to make the other changes. So I'll navigate back to the main part of the document so I can see what's happening as I'm drafting. So again, you've got this ability to specify the version of the curve. So perhaps I want to use as amended from time to time. I can then include definitions if I want to include them in both each covered master agreement and each covered transaction document. And I can select what I want to do in relation to the different rates. So perhaps I want to make the replacement of Ionia in covered master agreements or covered transaction documents with Ionia country rate applicable, and then also make the broken calculation period applicable after the relevant date. I can do the same in relation to USDR. Then I might want to do this one on or after the first date in such period. I'm then able to select the other, or I'm able to make elections in respect of the other options within the published document, and so I'm able to draft the document how I want it to be. You're able then to, if you want to send it directly to a counterparty, you're able to do that, but you're also able to create this as a preset, so that would effectively be a template version, so you'd then be able to use that as a starting point for perhaps your Euro zone counterparties. So that's a really kind of quick run through of the three, or the four, I should say, interest rate documents. I'm just giving you some idea of the functionality available on the platform. If there is any other questions that you have in relation to the interest rate reform documents, or is there particularly those on ISDA Create, or ISDA Create generally, then please do reach out. But otherwise, I'm going to hand back to Anne.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to everyone. It's now time for question and answers. So we've received a few, and we'll get started on those. But as a reminder, if you have additional questions, please include them in the chat box. So the first question we received is, why do these changes apply only to US dollar and euro? So that's a good question, and it goes back to the alternative risk-free rates that have been identified in the different jurisdictions. And in the United States and euro, the rates that were identified, so SOFR and euro STR respectively, were not the rates that were historically used for discounting and price alignment or interest amount in collateral for cleared and non-cleared derivatives. So the ARC in the United States, when it identified SOFR, first included as part of its PACE transition plan to encourage adoption of SOFR, a move by the CCPs to using SOFR instead of Fed funds price alignment and discounting. And while overall that PACE transition plan was about standing up SOFR as an alternative to US dollar LIBOR, even though this collateral change in and of itself has nothing to do with US dollar LIBOR, the thinking behind including it in that plan was that if the CCPs were using this rate for discounting and price alignment, that would encourage liquidity and hopefully be a key step in standing up SOFR as a widely used rate. Importantly, in the US, however, Fed funds is expected to continue. It's just not expected to be used long-term for collateral purposes for US dollar derivatives. And eventually, once a SOFR market further develops for OIS and basis swaps and other derivatives, it is expected that Fed funds will be used potentially less in those markets. Now, the same thing occurred in euro with an additional but important detail, and that is while euro STR was identified as the alternative in the Eurozone as opposed to Ionia, which has historically been used for collateral purposes and for OIS, in the Eurozone, Ionia will cease. And in addition to that, Ionia is currently, as we mentioned, a tracker for euro STR. So that, I think, amplifies the importance of a move away from Ionia for any purposes, and adds to the importance of standing up euro STR as a viable interest rate in the Eurozone. And that additional detail about Ionia and Euro SDR brings us on to the second question we received, and that is, why does the Ionia Amendment apply to floating rates and transactions in addition to collateral documentation? So I'm going to turn to my colleague Rick for that one.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Hello, everyone. And as you say, it really comes down to the fact that Ionia's administrator, the European Money Markets Institute, has already announced that Ionia will cease publication after the 3rd of January 2022. So that cessation has already been publicized. Ionia is not only used as a rate in collateral agreements, but as a floating rate in derivatives, among other products that it's used outside of the ISDA sphere. So at the point that we were putting together the longer form Ionia amendment agreement that Susanna was describing, our members had requested an agreement that was capable of amending collateral agreements, amending transaction documents, so confirmations for derivatives. And also there are some trading relationships where the definition of Ionia is incorporated at a master agreement level, and so those amendments also needed to be contemplated. And then it's quite long form because there are a number of different options that are available to counterparties with respect to the Ionia cessation, which aren't applicable to the SOFA transition. So, for example, parties could elect to incorporate the revised definition of Ionia that Susanna described, and that would have the effect of also incorporating standardized fallbacks to ESDA plus a spread, or they could decide that they wanted to transition across from Ionia to ESDA flat, and certainly for collateral agreements, that would mean alignment between cleared and non-cleared collateral arrangements. And then the reason that the short form was produced was because these initiatives are taking place at different times to a certain extent. The CCP move from PAI and discounting perspective has already happened, and so this is the point in time at which people are looking at their non-cleared portfolios and deciding whether or not to amend their collateral agreements, whereas the transaction transition may take a little bit longer, I'm guessing.
The next question we received is, how will substantive decisions regarding updates to the collateral definitions be handled, given that some counterparties may contractually commit to include those updates, as Susanna went over? Will actions taken by CCPs play a role in these decisions? Rick, do you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, sure. This is a very good question. I'm glad that it's been asked. So we lavished quite a lot of attention on this new tool that Susanna was describing, the interest rate override tool that allows people to incorporate the collateral agreement interest rate definitions and if you like, to benefit from subsequent amendments. Now, the potential downside from using that approach is that you might not like the amendments that come through subsequently, and if they automatically flow through to your contracts, then you'll be in a position where you are forced to try and negotiate them out of your contracts with your counterparties again, and it may be that they like them and you don't. So what we're not doing is sort of promoting this as the all singing, all dancing way that everyone should incorporate these definitions into their documents. It may well be that you take a risk-based view that it's better to use the more traditional incorporation methods, which Susanna also went through, which would say you're only incorporating the version of the definitions that was published the business day prior to execution of your agreement, or you incorporate a specific method. But to the extent that you get comfortable, and just to reiterate, the reason that this was put forward was because there was concern among some members of our working group that if there were rapid new versions of the definitions published, then that would involve going out to clients and having a new outreach to them. It may well happen more than once, and so again, it was a risk-based approach that was being discussed. If you decide that that's the right approach for you, I think it's fair to say there's no different way in which ISDA is thinking about how amendments would be made to the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. Let's say CCPs implement a new way of doing things which would impact the way that non-cleared collateral should be treated, and therefore impacted the collateral agreement interest rate definitions. Undoubtedly, we would hold a working group call, or lots of working group calls to ensure that that was appropriately socialized and discussed. But ultimately, if the working group took a decision that you did not like as an institution, and you had used this new tool, then you would be effectively stuck with it. And to give a sort of live example of that, version 2 of the definitions that was published included things that weren't in version 1 and that would have applied to the euro rates that were in version 1. So that, the best example probably is that version 1 didn't have any provisions dealing with temporary non-publication of the rate, and version 2 did, and that was because we were waiting for the IBOR fallbacks wording around temporary non-publication to be finalized before trying to incorporate it into this definitional booklet. So we knew when we published version 1 that we would be including this in version 2. At the same time, hypothetically, if you had a strong objection to that temporary disruption language being included, then probably the interest rate override and as amended from time to time approach to incorporating the definitions wouldn't have been appropriate for you.
Thanks, Rick. We received a question about affiliate CSAs and whether there's an expectation that market participants will update US dollar affiliates or inter-affiliate CSAs to use SOFR interest amount. Susanna, do you have any insight on that?
Yep, thanks, Anne. So as market participants will probably be aware, the ARC actually put out a recommendation in its best practice recommendations, recommending that interdealer CSAs are amended to use SOFR for US dollar collateral, and that should take place by the end of this year. Whether we're expecting firms to do that or not, we are expecting firms to make that update. It is logical that firms will want to align with the CCP switch. In other words, they'll want to amend their internal discounting curves for valuing OTC derivatives from Fed funds to SOFR to ensure that discounting on their uncleared portfolio of derivatives aligns with discounting on their cleared portfolio of derivatives. And it's logical for that alignment to take place when the CCP makes a switch. Now, when they switch their internal discounting curves, they'll also need to amend their CSAs to align the collateral rate with the discounting rate that they're using. Firms are unlikely to do this before the switchover date, but we do expect firms to do this on or around the switchover date and by the end of this year. Was there anything else, Anne?
Yeah, no, I think that's hopefully great in response to that question. We did receive another question about approaches firms might take, and that is whether firms might enter into new CSAs that reference SOFR as the interest amount and retain their existing CSAs, or whether they're just expected to amend their existing CSAs with the templates that you described.
Yeah, we would not expect market participants to enter into new CSAs because any new CSA negotiation reopens the possibility to negotiate the other credit terms in that CSA as well. And I don't think firms will have any appetite for that. No, the expectation is that firms will make a simple amendment to their existing CSAs to switch the interest rate from Fed funds to SOFR and to use the bilateral templates that have been published in order to achieve that.
We received a question about the interplay between the EONIA amendment that Susanna described and Rick has referenced, and other work that ISDA is doing not covered by this webinar to implement fallbacks for LIBOR and other key IBORs. and specifically whether the terms of the EONIA Amendment are part of the protocol to implement the IBOR changes. And the answer is no. The work to implement IBOR fallback will be via a supplement to the current interest rate definitions, or the 2006 ISDA definitions, implemented via a protocol that only incorporates those changes. That IBOR work dates back to 2016 and is very specifically focused on the discontinuation of key IBORs. It also involves work that ISDA has done with respect to spread adjustments that differ from the conversations occurring regarding the differences between EONIA and Euro STR. So more information about that protocol, its substance and timing, is available on the ISDA website. But for those market participants looking to address the cessation of EONIA, we would point them towards the EONIA amendment. And if you're just looking to make collateral changes in the short term, the Euro STR and or combined Euro STR and US dollar templates. So switching back to the collateral definitions, Rick, are changes to the definitions that are currently included in version 1 and version 2 of those booklets expected in subsequent versions, or are new versions only to add new rates?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think this goes back to what I was saying on my previous answer, that I don't think you can assume it would only be to add new rates. Undoubtedly, that's the likely trend going forward when we publish new versions. But as I say, there may be changes to the existing rates. We don't have any planned at the moment, but you couldn't rule it out. If, for example, there were subsequent comments about the way that it had been drafted, which suggested that it didn't work very well, then we would look to make changes through this kind of versioning mechanism. Can I say one more thing as well, Anne, about the question on the protocol? Because
Sure.
From a Euro perspective, we had working group discussions on whether there should be a protocol at this time, and there was no consensus for a protocol. In fact, some people said they would definitely not use it, and so that's kind of a knife in the back of a protocol idea, because we need people to widely adopt it for it to be effective. But that's not to say it will never happen. I think the problem with the protocol at the moment is that ISDA is not in a position to say what compensation should be payable, if any, between counterparties that move off, say, EONIA to ESTA flat, which would align the cleared and non-cleared collateral arrangements, because that compensation might, very well change from relationship to relationship. So no protocol we would be capable of producing could affect that transition to ESTA flat, which means the only protocol we could produce is one that would go from EONIA to ESTA plus 8 basis points, 8.5 basis points, which is the underlying methodology of EONIA. So that would be zero impact from a value transfer point of view. But the working group sentiment was that that's not an appropriate thing to do right now, that people want to concentrate on transitioning collateral agreements to ESTA flat where possible. If we get further down the line towards the ultimate cessation of the publication of EONIA after the 3rd of January 2022, and the bulk of the market has not yet moved, then I think we would be more than open to having further working group discussions to see if, okay, the transition to ESTA flat hasn't occurred, is now the time when a protocol would actually be of most use.
Thanks, Rick. Very helpful, I think, on both points. We received a question about incorporation of the collateral definitions and incorporation of specific rates in those definitions. So, Susanna, the question is, if we used one of the rates, so for example, SONIA collateral rate, in a CSA and reference the collateral definitions as amended from time to time, do we still need to state interest rate override in that CSA?
No, you don't need to state interest rate override if you have already used the collateral rate definition, SONIA collateral rate, you will get that collateral rate as set out in the collateral definitions. And if the collateral definitions are incorporated as amended from time to time, then you will get that SONIA collateral rate definition as amended from time to time if it is amended in later versions of the definitions. So you don't need to use interest rate override in that scenario.
The next question we received is about how interest is actually calculated on collateral for both cleared and non-cleared derivatives using these rates. Deepak, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, Anne. So interest or the rates contemplate just a simple rate of interest, so the regular overnight rate. And so to the extent that parties want to compound the interest rate over the interest period within their CSAs, then they will need to say that. And so that is commonly done under the 1995 CSA, for example, with a sentence to that effect. And if you're using the VM CSA, then there is an election within the VM CSA that allows parties to opt into daily interest compounding. So the interaction between the two will, in the context of that agreement, allow you to compound over the interest period.
We also received a question that I think relates to the comments Rick was just making about the EONIA protocol, but asks whether ISDA has any mechanism to resolve the value transfer when moving from one rate to another rate in non-cleared CSAs. We talked at the beginning about the mechanisms that CCPs have put in place. But for non-cleared derivatives, as Rick alluded to, there is not an industry standard. Those conversations need to occur on a bilateral basis. And that's one of the key reasons why we've published templates as opposed to some sort of multilateral mechanism. We've received a number of additional questions about the approach to legacy versus new derivatives entered into under CSAs for US dollar derivatives. Susanna, is there anything you want to add on that point?
It is possible that firms might contemplate splitting transactions into two collateral pools and collateralizing legacy transactions under one CSA, which continued to use Fed funds, and then having a separate CSA which collateralizes transactions using SOFR as the interest rate. That obviously has implications for margining. Although it should not impact the netting under that master agreement, it means there's two different collateral pools. It's going to have operational impacts as well. And I confess that to date, I have not seen anybody proposing that. That looks like a more complicated route than to just updating the CSA to provide for SOFR collateral rate and agreeing what the value change in respect of that is and exchanging compensation. So that's not to say that's not a feasible route, it's just that we have not seen that proposed to date.
Thanks, Susanna. We received a question about the thousands of collateral agreements in place and whether it's realistic to expect a transition to happen in the fourth quarter alone. Rick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So, you have our deepest sympathies because I think it's not an easy process, and we understand that. I don't think there's a regulatory deadline for transitioning collateral agreements that I'm aware of off these rates and onto the new risk-free rates. It's more a question of whether commercially parties want alignment between their cleared and non-cleared collateral arrangements. And obviously the CCPs in Europe have already transitioned, and obviously in the US they are about to transition. And so that's really where the time pressure is coming from. I think that we've explained the reasons why, particularly around the question of value transfer, ISDA is not able to run a protocol process, which would otherwise perhaps have made this a little more straightforward. But that's why we are demonstrating the ISDA Create system. It's not just a hard sell on our part, but we genuinely believe that ISDA Create has the ability to improve the efficiencies around this process. Deepak, I don't know if you want to step in and just explain some of those benefits briefly.
Yeah, sure, Rick. And it is that kind of middle ground, if you like, between a protocol where you adhere and hey presto, changes are made versus individual bilateral outreaches. So I think the platform will be really useful for this exercise. So for example, you'll be able to produce multiple forms of the agreement and send them out to multiple counterparties in one go. We found the automation process, and users have already told us that the automation process has cut down significantly on the timing around getting documents out there. And then the other piece that we are seeing in the context of rate reform generally is questions being asked of regulated firms as to the progress that is being made on their remediation or transition efforts. And again, so one of the features that a number of firms have found useful is the ability to produce management information as to the status of various negotiations. So as Rick says, completely recognize that this is not a pain-free task, but we all hope that the ISDA Create platform will at least take some of that pain away.
Thanks, Deepak and Rick. We're close to the end of time and haven't received any more questions, but is there anything that any of the panelists would like to add or clarify before we close?
I guess going back to the question, I had said there's no regulatory deadline for transitioning collateral arrangements off these rates, and one of my fellow panelists has kindly pointed out that I think that perhaps the ARC issued a recommendation around transitioning to SOFR during the fourth quarter, which is probably what drove the question in the first place. But probably not a regulatory requirement. It's a recommendation by a risk-free rate working group. So it does come down to whether you're able to and willing to commit enough resources in order to transition your entire portfolio within that timeline, and hopefully ISDA Create will assist you in that process.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks to everyone, and thanks to all of you for joining us. A recording of this webinar with the question and answer session will be available on the ISDA website in the coming days. If you continue to have questions about these or other ISDA benchmark initiatives, please email benchmarkreform@isda.org. Thank you.